White death? I leaned against the window of the helicopter, my gaze fixated on the sea of white that stretched out beneath us. My Alaskan Malamute, Tito, was sprawled across the floor, his snout pressed against the cool glass. The dog's brown eyes mirrored his master's, both filled with anticipation. I know how you feel, Tito. I'm not a fan of flying either. Tito let out a long exhale, rested his head on his paws. The helicopter, a Bell 407GX, hummed loudly as it fought against the Antarctic winds. The whirling blades were a stark contrast to the silent, unending expanse of ice and snow beneath them. My gloved hand absent-mindedly stroked Tito's thick fur, the rhythmic action providing a semblance of comfort in the middle of the desolate landscape. Looks like your dog's more excited than you, Kevin, the pilot, a burly man named Jack, shouted over the roar of the engine. He had a grizzled beard and eyes that had seen more than their fair share of the world. He was no stranger to the Antarctic's harsh climate, his experience evident in the way he maneuvered the aircraft. I chuckled, my breath fogging up the window. He does have a thing for snow, he admitted. But don't let that fool you, Jack. I've been waiting for this moment for years. I'm just glad you guys needed extra hands out here. I can tell, buddy, Jack replied with a grin. Not everyone chooses to spend their holidays at the end of the world. Yeah, I made a trip out here last week and they seemed like they were a little down. Apparently it's harder than they thought operating that machinery out in the field. I assume that's why they brought you on. As the banter filled the cabin, the helicopter began its descent towards the Antarctic base. Jack's experienced hands worked the controls, adjusting to the changing wind currents. The base came into view, a collection of small structures that looked like toys against the vast landscape of white. The helicopter's skids made contact with the snow with a soft thud, causing Tito to perk up. Jack cut the engine, and the sudden silence felt almost deafening after the constant drone of the rotor blades. Welcome to Antarctica, Jack announced, a hint of pride in his voice. With no small amount of sarcasm. I looked out the window again, this time at the cluster of buildings that would be my home for the next few months. The Antarctic base looked more real now, its details clear without the blur of movement. I felt a rush of excitement at the prospect of the adventures and discoveries that were surely to come from this experience.
Tito, sensing my excitement, wagged his tail, his eyes bright. I laughed and ruffled the dog's fur. Ready for some fun in the snow, boy? The moment the helicopter's doors swung open, the Antarctic wind launched itself at me with such ferocity, it was like a swift kick in the nuts. I sucked in a breath, the cold air slicing into my lungs, and I had to fight the urge to double over. Tito leaped out of the craft before me, his large furry frame disappearing into a cloud of snow. The sight brought a small grin to my face. The big lug loved the snow. I ducked and shielded my face from the swirling ice, stepping out of the helicopter and into the biting cold. Raising a gloved hand, I waved to the pilot as he lifted off, disappearing into the gloom with a promise of returning with more supplies after the storm. I turned to see Tito, already shaking himself off near the entrance of the facility, spraying a flurry of snowflakes all over the entryway. I pulled my gloves off, wincing as the cold seared my skin, my fingers already numb from the brief exposure. I rubbed them together, blowing into my hands to try to warm them up. The cold, metal walls of the facility were covered with pictures, a montage of moments captured in time. Some were taken here, frozen smiles in a frozen world, while others were personal mementos from the crew's life before this Antarctic mission. They seemed so far removed from the bleak whiteness outside. Kevin, welcome. The voice pulled me out of my thoughts. Mark Davis, the station manager, was standing there, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. A warm smile spread across his face as he greeted me and Tito, who had already taken a liking to him. Tito, leave that man alone. He called after his dog that was rubbing his wet body against the men's clean pants. Oh, it's quite all right, I have a few dogs waiting for me back home, keeping the family safe. This big boy is just excited, and I don't blame him. Once we get set up, we're going to have some fun. Both on and off the clock, you quickly come to realize we're pretty tightly knit around here, but we like to stay loose. Mark led us down a narrow corridor to our accommodations, a small but cozy room equipped with the essentials. At the threshold, he turned and said, "Make yourself comfortable, Kevin. There's a meeting with the rest of the crew in an hour." As the door closed behind him, I looked around at my temporary home. This was it, my life for the foreseeable future. I glanced down at Tito, his tail wagging as he explored the room. After settling Tito and myself in our new quarters, it was time for the meeting. The briefing room reminded me of a middle school classroom, complete with a chalkboard at the front. Addressing the room were Dr. Lisa Anderson, the lead scientist of our mission, Dr. Maria Rodriguez, the marine biologist, and Mark Davis, who was still wearing his station manager hat. The room was filled with a collection of scientists, researchers, and academics. I felt a sense of familiarity wash over me. Some of these faces were familiar colleagues I'd crossed paths with during conferences and seminars. Some were new promising friendships forged in the crucible of a shared Antarctic winter. I didn't know them well, but I felt that would change in the coming months. Dr. Anderson broke the silence, outlining the mission ahead of us. We were to extract core samples from 7 different sites. My team, she explained, would be responsible for the extraction, while a second team based at a remote site would analyze the samples as they came in. If we managed to complete our task in a timely manner, a second phase, a biology mission, would be launched. Mark took over then, assuring us that we had ample supplies, equipment, and, somewhat surprisingly, weapons. The mention of weapons caused a stir in the room, heads turning in confusion, eyebrows raised in silent questions. It was Alan Smith, the meteorologist, who broke the silence. Why would we need weapons in the middle of the Antarctic wasteland? The question hung in the air, a bubble of apprehension that no one seemed eager to pop. Dr. Rodriguez was the one to answer. There are polar bears to consider, she began, her voice steady. And there's also the possibility of encountering covert operations from other countries conducting similar experiments. As she said this, her gaze swept over the room, meeting each of our eyes. This last threat can't be confirmed, but the FBI has advised us to be prepared. Leaving the briefing room, I reached down and ran my fingers through Tito's thick fur. The dog looked up at me, his eyes full of trust. We were in this together. In the equipment room, I shrugged on my specialized suit, designed to shield us from the ferocious Antarctic winds. Around me, the rest of the team was doing the same. Emily Baker, the field biologist, was practically buzzing with excitement. She confessed that this was her first mission outside the facility since she had arrived. 2 months, she replied when I asked how long she had been here. I couldn't even begin to imagine what that kind of isolation would feel like, trapped in this metallic cocoon amidst the vast white wilderness. Outside, the wind began to howl, a harbinger of the storm our meteorologist had predicted for later tonight. We had a window of 4 hours to extract at least 2 core samples. The clock was ticking. Once we were all suited up, we stepped out into the Antarctic breeze, the cold biting through our protective layers. The team climbed onto the ATVs, revving up the engines and speeding off towards the first site, with Tito running alongside us. The journey was both breathtakingly beautiful and strangely desolate. The landscape was a pristine canvas of white, untouched and untamed, stretching out as far as the eye could see. Ice crystals glittered in the sunlight, casting a million tiny rainbows in every direction. Yet, there was an overwhelming sense of solitude, a profound silence that whispered of the isolation we were stepping into. If there was evidence of wildlife, it was concealed by the wind. Upon reaching the site, our teams split up. One headed to the research post to prepare for the incoming samples, while my team made our way to the drilling site. We began setting up the core drill, a massive piece of machinery designed to bore into the frozen earth below us. Positioning the drill was a precise task, and we worked together seamlessly, despite the biting cold and the looming deadline. Once we were ready, I hit the switch and the drill roared to life. The process of extracting the core sample was a slow, meticulous one, the drill inching its way into the earth, capturing centuries, perhaps millennia, of history in its wake. While it did its job, we passed the time with small conversation. Dr. Raj Patel asked, "So have you ever been to the Arctic or Alaska at least?" His face was red from the icy wind. "No, nothing like this. Most of the time I'm in desert climates or gathering species from some jungle. This is more snow than I think I've seen collectively in my whole life." He smiled. "If you think this is bad, wait till this storm touches down. With any luck it'll only last the night. I couldn't conceal my shock. What do you mean lucky? How long do these type of storms last? Could be hours, could be days. I've been here for 2 years and I still have no clue how this all works. Minus being held back on our schedule, we should be fine. We have enough supplies for a year, and the first came the worst, we could always go hunting. Sea lions are always just around the corner here. But do watch out for polar bears, they blend in so well, unbelievably in fact. The first core sample finally emerged, a cylinder of ice that held untold secrets within its frozen depths. Leaving Dr. Raj at the drilling site, I loaded the first core sample onto the ATV. Tito and I made our way to the research station, a beacon of civilization amidst the desolate wilderness. The scientists there took the sample with an eagerness that matched my own, their eyes shining with anticipation. They were already nose-deep in tablets and computers before I exited the warmth of the station. When we returned to the drilling site, we loaded the drill onto the pallet attached to the ATV and began the journey to the next site. As we worked to assemble the drill again, we exchanged banter about the harshness of the Antarctic and the creature comforts we missed. I found myself yearning for a warm cup of coffee, while Raj mused about a hot shower. Both were available at the facility but not the comfort they sought. But nonetheless, a long hot shower was exactly what I planned. And whether Tito wanted it or not, the smelly dog is going to take a dip as well. Once the drill was assembled, we initiated the second core drilling. The temperature had dropped further, and the wind had picked up, turning the snowflakes into tiny, icy daggers. There were no more jokes or stories, just the two of us huddled against the cold, watching the drill do its work. Suddenly, a loud yell cut through the silence. It was unlike anything I had ever heard, an eerie, animalistic sound that echoed through the frozen landscape like a train horn. Raj and I scanned our surroundings, but all we saw was an endless expanse of white. Did anyone else hear that? I asked into my walkie-talkie. Hear what? Dr. Anderson's voice crackled through the radio. I shook my head and muttered a dismissive never mind. The drill stopped then, bringing up the second core sample. Glancing at my watch, I realized we had less than half an hour to get back to the facility. Emily Baker's sigh of disappointment echoed over the radio. We had hoped to deviate to more biological studies, but time was against us. Don't worry, Mark Davis's voice came over the comm, we'll have another chance tomorrow if the storm lets up. Raj and I exchanged a glance. We both knew that was unlikely. The meteorologist had already predicted the storm would last at least 24 hours. We quickly disassembled the drill and packed it into its protective case, leaving it at the site for the next round of drilling. Tito was panting next to the ATV, his breath forming misty clouds in the cold air. I looked at him and smiled. Come on, buddy, time for a ride, I said. Tito, instead of running alongside the ATV as before, found a spot on my lap for the ride back. As we sped off towards the base, against the backdrop of the Antarctic wilderness, I held him close, drawing comfort from his warmth in the face of the approaching blizzard. Back at the research facility, I stood under the hot shower, letting the steaming water wash over me. The heat seeped into my chilled bones, a welcome reprieve after hours of working in the harsh Antarctic cold. Tito was outside the shower area, feasting on a bowl of slightly cooked dog food and lapping up ice-cold water. The look of contentment on his face was unmistakable. If he could talk, I'm sure he'd be bragging about his meal. A loud bang against the hull of the facility jolted me out of my thoughts. I quickly turned off the shower, my heart pounding. Stepping out and reaching for a towel, I saw Tito looking at me, his ears pricked up, clearly disturbed by the noise. Too weary to sleep but too curious to ignore the noise, I decided to investigate. As I walked through the empty corridors, I found myself in the mess hall. The chef was off duty, but there was an array of snacks and microwavable foods available. I grabbed a snack for myself and was soon joined by Dr. Lisa Anderson. We chatted about the day's work, and she remarked on how quickly we'd managed to extract the core samples. Despite not meeting our initial quota, we had still managed to gather valuable data. After exchanging a few more pleasantries, we each headed back to our quarters for the night. Once back in my room, I settled into bed with Tito. The dog's warm body pressed against mine was soothing, and before long, we both drifted off to sleep. A few hours later, another loud bang jolted me awake. Frustrated and curious, I threw on some protective clothing and grabbed a mag light from the supply room. But as I approached the exit, Tito stood in my way, whining and whimpering. "What is it, boy?" I asked, but he just continued to whimper. Taking his unusual behavior as a warning, I decided against venturing out into the blizzard. I returned to my room, my curiosity unsatisfied, but respecting Tito's instincts. Sleep, however, eluded me for the rest of the night, the mysterious noises echoing in my mind. I stretched my arms high above my head, feeling a satisfying pull in my muscles. Tito, my faithful four-legged companion, mirrored my actions with a big yawn, his tail wagging lazily. The smell of sizzling sausage and cooking bacon wafted through the air, luring us out of our room and towards the mess hall. It was impossible to resist the temptation. As we made our way towards the mess hall, the atmosphere was markedly different from the previous night. Gone was the sterile, hospital-like vibe that had permeated the place. Instead, it now resembled a bustling Applebee's during a midday rush. The entire base seemed to have gathered there, and laughter and good times filled the air. I grabbed a plate for myself and a few spare sausages for Tito, along with 2 generous scoops of eggs. Tito eagerly sat beside me, his tail wagging furiously as I set his food on the floor. With a sense of anticipation, I joined a table occupied by other scientists. 2 faces were vaguely familiar to me, people I had encountered in passing, but the rest were new acquaintances waiting to be made. With my fork and knife in hand, I dove into my plate, relishing the delicious flavors that filled my mouth. The food was excellent, and it seemed like the base had spared no effort in providing a satisfying breakfast for everyone. As we all engaged in eating, I couldn't help but bring up the strange bang we had heard the previous night. I was curious to know if anyone else had experienced a similar phenomenon. To my surprise, everyone at the table seemed nonchalant about it, as if it were a common occurrence. "So, did any of you hear that weird bang last night?" I asked, trying to keep the curiosity out of my voice. A scientist sitting across from me looked up from his plate and chuckled. "Oh, that happens a lot around here," he said casually, shrugging his shoulders. "It's nothing to worry about." I exchanged bewildered glances with the others at the table. How could they be so relaxed about something that had seemed so out of the ordinary to me? Another scientist chimed in, his mouth full of eggs. "Yeah, it's just some routine experiments. Sometimes things get a bit explosive," he said with a mischievous grin. The table erupted in laughter, as if this were an inside joke that I was not yet privy to. It dawned on me that there was a lot more to this base and its operations than met the eye. Leaving the loud atmosphere of the mess hall behind, it was clear that venturing out into the elements would be futile and dangerous. With a sigh, I realized that the main purpose of my occupancy at this facility would have to wait for another day. Seeking an alternative task to occupy my time, I made my way towards Mark Davis, hoping that he could point me in the right direction. If there was something that needed attention, he would surely know. When I approached his room, he was reading through logs. "Hey, Mark," I called out as I approached him. "With this blizzard going on, it seems like my original plans are out of the question. Is there anything else around here that needs my attention?" Mark paused for a moment, considering my request. Then, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "You know what? There is something you can help with. Chris Young, our electrician, has been dealing with a persistent problem in the fire alarm system. He could use an extra pair of hands. Do you know anything about electrical systems?" I hesitated for a moment, contemplating my limited knowledge in that area. "Well, a little," I replied cautiously. "I'm not an expert, but I can certainly lend a hand." Mark nodded approvingly. "Great. Head over to the east wing of the facility. Chris should be there. Just follow the corridor until you reach the junction, take a left, and you'll find him." Thanking Mark for his guidance, Tito and I trekked through the labyrinthine halls of the facility. The corridors seemed oddly quiet, with only the sound of our footsteps echoing through the halls. As we walked, after what felt like a maze of twists and turns, I finally arrived at the eastern wing. There, amidst a tangle of wires and circuit boards, was Chris Young. He was a young man, as his name implied, with a face that bore the markings of hard work. His eyebrows were smudged with dirt and oil, and his leather gloves were almost black from the materials he had been handling. Clearing my throat, I made my presence known. Chris turned his attention towards me, his eyes weary but neutral. "You must be my little helper," he said, his voice slightly muffled by the noise of the equipment. "Mark mentioned that you might be able to lend a hand." A faint smile tugged at the corners of Chris's lips. "Good timing. We've been having this persistent issue with the fire alarm system. It keeps malfunctioning, and we can't pinpoint the cause. I've been troubleshooting it for days, but it seems to be one step ahead of me. I think I've done all I can from my end. If this doesn't work, we might have to take an adventure outside." The blizzard outside raged on, its howling winds and relentless snowfall creating a whiteout that engulfed the entire research base. Chris had just come to the conclusion that he had done all he could from within the electronics room. Fixing the fire alarm system required venturing outside. I glanced at Tito, who lay curled up in the corner of the room. Even he seemed to sense the looming danger. His ears were pricked up, and his tail wagged nervously. I patted his head, reassuring him that everything would be all right, though deep down, I shared his unease. With a resolute countenance, I made up my mind. Sitting around and waiting for the storm to pass was not an option. I quickly suited up in my heavy-duty gear, layering myself with thermal clothing and strapping on the necessary equipment. I grabbed a flashlight, a pair of walkie-talkies, and emergency hand warmers to combat the bone-chilling cold. Chris had also instructed me to bring along a set of tools. It was crucial for him to monitor the systems inside while I worked on the external components, ensuring that our efforts were effective. Opening the heavy door, I was immediately hit by a blast of frigid air, causing me to shiver involuntarily. The wind howled, drowning out the sound of my own thoughts. Snowflakes whipped around, stinging my face like tiny needles. The blizzard had transformed the landscape into a featureless void, where visibility was reduced to mere feet. With my flashlight leading the way, I trudged forward, each step a battle against the deep snowdrifts that threatened to swallow me whole. Tito followed close behind, his thick coat providing some protection against the elements. The gear I gave him did the rest. We communicated through the walkie-talkies, ensuring that we stayed within range of each other. Chris tested the line for a comms check. We were in the green. The walk to the fire alarm system felt like a wall-less maze. The wind and snow seemed to conspire against us, testing our mettle. But I pressed on, fueled by the knowledge that we were doing what needed to be done. Finally, I reached the exterior panel housing the fire alarm system. Snow had accumulated around it, partially obscuring its presence. I brushed off the snow and began my work, carefully following Chris's instructions relayed over the walkie-talkie. I could hear the concern in his voice as he monitored the systems from inside. "All right, take your impact drill and hit those 4 corners in that panel." The sound of the drill muffled in the blizzard. "Okay, now you should see a bundle of wires, for yellow for green to black and 1 red." I confirmed all wires were there, intact and visible. "Now go in your toolbox and grab the test light. It looks like a little screwdriver with a light bulb." "I found it now. How does this work?" "All you have to do is make contact with the tip. I know the nodes. If you get any red lights, let me know." I went down the line and tested each one, confirming that one of the black wires in the housing had no current. I was instructed to replace it with the spool of the same color-coded wire. This task in any other circumstance would have been easy and over with, but the fact I couldn't see my hands in front of my face posed a real problem. By the time I finally had secured the wire, my fingers felt like they were ready to fall off. I slipped them back into my gloves with my emergency hand warmers, and thanked the Lord for those. I stood there, listening to the static crackle from the walkie-talkie, waiting for Chris's next instruction. His voice came through, a sharp burst of sound that cut through the wind. "Kevin, get your ass and Tito's back inside before you both freeze. I've got a connection now. At the mention of Tito, I glanced down at my faithful companion. The dog had been standing silent, a statue in the blizzard, but as I looked closer, I realized his hackles were raised. He was growling, a low rumble that I hadn't initially heard over the wind. His ears were perked up, and he was staring into the white veil of the blizzard. There was nothing I could see, the visibility was only a few feet, but Tito was alert and focused. And then I saw it. A pattern in the snow, a disruption in the pristine white landscape footprints. They were immense, the size of my forearm, and they led up to where we were standing. They were fresh because as I watched, the blizzard began to cover them up. A chill that had nothing to do with the freezing weather crept into my soul. I grabbed Tito by the collar and we sprinted for the door of the facility. I threw panicked glances behind me the whole way there. As soon as we were inside, I bent over, gasping for breath and trying to rub some warmth back into my frozen hands. Tito took a moment to shake the snow out of his fur, flinging tiny droplets everywhere. Chris came running into the room, his face flushed with worry. "Why didn't you answer on the comms?" he demanded, looking at me worriedly. I patted my pockets, my heart sinking as I realized I must have dropped the walkie-talkie. "Must have left it outside," I said, trying to keep my breakfast in me. Chris's eyes narrowed, studying my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What the hell went wrong?" I hesitated, not wanting to alarm the young man. I barely understood what I had seen myself. So I shook my head, forcing a weak smile onto my face. "Just the cold getting to me," I lied. I followed Chris into the control room, watching as he worked to restore full connection to the fire alarm system and other malfunctioning nodes. I glanced at my watch, noting that dinner was only a few hours away. "Join me for dinner later?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "You know this place pretty well, based on your job I would say better than anyone here." Chris looked up from his work, a smile spreading across his face. "See you there." As I sat in my personal quarters, stroking Tito's fur, I couldn't shake off the nagging feeling of uncertainty. Those footprints earlier had been haunting my thoughts ever since. I desperately tried to recall any documentaries or information about polar bears that could explain their presence here, but deep down, I knew I was grasping at straws. There was something more to this, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The words "abominable snowman" sat on the tip of my tongue. I smiled at the thought, fuck me, I need a drink. I would settle for a solid meal, Tito barked in response, echoing my sentiment. A few hours later, after polishing off my dinner in the facility's mess hall, I returned to my quarters once more. The silence fell upon me as I closed the door behind me, and I found solace in the solitude. Tito was the only living being that shared any space with me. We were the closest thing to nomads, constantly moving from one research endeavor to another. In the shower, steam filling the room, I allowed my mind to wander. Thoughts of the home I had left behind for this mission flooded my consciousness. The empty halls, once so familiar and comforting, now felt distant and foreign. Just like the people who used to grace its halls, I, too, felt like a stranger in my former abode. But this research facility, with its sterile walls and monotonous activity, had become a home of sorts. It provided a purpose, a sense of belonging that I had been yearning for. As I finished my shower, I turned my attention to Tito. He was patiently waiting, his fur damp and glistening. I smiled at his eagerness as he jumped into the steaming body of water without a second thought. Bathing Tito was a routine we had grown accustomed to, a simple act that brought a sense of normalcy to our lifestyle. As I scrubbed his fur, I couldn't help but feel a deep appreciation for the companionship he provided. Tito was my anchor, a constant source of comfort, he was my spirit animal. Together, with each stroke of the brush, I reflected on the mysteries that surrounded us. When the knock came, a familiar pattern of 3 quick taps and a pause, it was Sarah Mitchell, the environmental engineer of our facility. It was late, but the concept of time seemed to warp in this place. "Care for some nighttime shenanigans?" Her voice was warm and inviting. The corners of her lips curled into a playful smile, her eyes twinkling with mischief. It was as if she had delved into the depths of my thoughts. The isolation of our facility had been gnawing at my nerves for days, and the prospect of some mind-altering, or even a game of chance, sounded like a welcome break from the thoughts that held me in unease. "Lead the way, Sarah," I responded, a sense of anticipation prickling at my skin. Following her felt like journeying into the heart of a mechanical beast. The corridors twisted and turned, sterile walls and artificial lighting. We moved deeper into the complex, descending into the cargo bay. Its vastness was hidden in shadow, the only light coming from the distant overheads illuminating the far corners. Hidden behind towering stacks of shipment crates and supplies, a makeshift table had been set up. Across its surface, various forms of currency, coins, and playing cards were strewn. It was an oasis of humanity in an otherwise sterile monolith of steel and concrete. Sophia Ramirez, our resident microbiologist with her dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, was already there. She removed her duffel bag from a chair and tapped its surface, inviting me to sit. I obliged, taking in the scene. James Turner, our communications specialist, was already shuffling a deck of cards. His hands moved with a deftness that suggested years of practice. Sarah, ever the host, retrieved a spare tumbler from a nearby crate. She filled it to the brim with a rich, amber liquid that glowed under the lighting. The scent that wafted from it was unmistakably whiskey. I threw it back in one gulp, the liquid fire spreading a comforting warmth through my body. The game began amidst laughter and playful jibes. As the night wore on, the conversation flowed freely. It started with tales of past exploits, wins and losses, but soon took an unexpected turn. Talk of the paranormal surfaced, whispers of the snowman echoed around the table. I would have dismissed it as a joke, had I not seen those peculiar footprints during my outside trip. They were unlike anything I'd seen, large, and decidedly non-human. "Has anyone actually seen this snowman?" I asked, my voice belling my incredulity. James, his hands momentarily stilling over the deck of cards, looked up. "I saw a silhouette once, while loading supplies in the docking bay. It was brief, but I'm certain of what I saw. And there have been missing supplies too." His voice trailed off, his eyes meeting mine with a seriousness that bore into me. The card game was drawing to a close. Sophia and Sarah were both leaning heavily on the table, their laughter a little too loud, their words slurring. The whiskey, it seemed, had finally hit its mark. Across from me, James was squinting at his cards, his brow furrowed in concentration. We were both down to our last move, and I held my best hand of the night. The tension was thick, the air was electric. Casually, as if it were just another topic of conversation, I asked, "Has anyone ever really seen or heard anything about the snowman? Other than the silhouette?" The chatter ceased and all eyes turned to me. Sarah, in her drunken stupor, swiveled her eyes towards me, looking as if she was struggling to focus. "Over the years, crew have come and gone," she began, her voice a raspy whisper. "And some have said they've seen it. Those that have, compare it to an upright white ape." The words abominable snowman and yeti flashed in my mind, but I was certain there must be better explanations. Without another word, I laid down my cards. James threw his hands up in defeat, and the room erupted in laughter. We all smiled, the tension from the game finally dissipating. One by one, we began to retreat to our quarters. Upon entering my room, I found Tito staring out the porthole. As I approached, he turned around and whimpered. Curiosity piqued, I moved to the window. What I saw there made my blood run cold. A pair of yellow eyes stared back at me, set in a brown face framed by white fur and hair. Its stone countenance showed no emotion, just stared impassively into my eyes. I was so startled, I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. Then, as quickly as it had come, the creature broke its gaze with me. Tito began barking furiously, his protective instincts kicking in. The sound was deafening in the small room, and within seconds, the rest of the crew came piling up at the threshold, their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. "What happened?" James asked, his voice barely audible over Tito's barking. With as much calm as I could muster, I told them what I had seen. The creature, I said, it was looking right at me. The room fell silent, the only sound, Tito's continued barking. It was clear that our night was far from over. We all gathered in the briefing room, the only space vast enough to accommodate the entire crew and devoid of windows. Inside, Sarah and Sophia were still a bit tipsy, but they managed to hold together, their faces set in an expression of grave seriousness. Mark Davis, the man in charge of the facility, and Lisa Anderson, the lead scientist, stood at the front of the room, their faces grim. Mark was the first to speak. His voice echoed through the room, his orders clear and concise. All technicians are to remain in the building, even when the blizzard passes, he instructed firmly. If there's anything we have to do, make sure we do it in teams. Lisa Anderson, her eyes bright with a mix of fear and excitement, added on to Mark's orders. This might be more important than half of the things that we were here for, she pointed out, her voice ringing with authority. A sample of the creature's fur, flesh or blood would make this mission extremely successful. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in, before continuing, with the unforeseen presence of this creature, if we could prove its existence, we would not only be notable scientists but rich as kings. Her words hung heavily in the room, a potency of danger and opportunity that none of us could ignore lying behind her words. The room was thick with tension, but there was a shared understanding. We were all in this together, for better or for worse. We began to bunker down, securing all the doors and sealing all the portholes. Our mundane routine suddenly felt like a military operation, each move calculated and cautious. Just as we began to disperse, a loud banging echoed throughout the facility. The noise was deafening, and it sent a shockwave of fear through the room. Without hesitation, we broke into teams of 2 and began to scour the ship, searching for the source of the noise. A piercing alarm cut through the air, followed by an artificial voice over the comms. "Breach in the cargo loading bay," it announced monotonously. The moment the AI alerted us, Tito and I immediately bolted towards the cargo bay. The echoing cries of the facility's alarm seeped into the frigid hallways, punctuated by my hurried footsteps and Tito's excited panting. The apprehension hung in the air, clinging to the sterile walls as we navigated the labyrinthine network of corridors. As we rounded the final corner, I was met with a scene of organized chaos. A good portion of the crew was already there. Young, our dedicated electrician, and Mark Davis, the man who ran the facility, were armed with the only 2 rifles available to us. The rest of the crew gripped makeshift weapons, their faces hardened by fear. The cargo bay doors hung open, the wrath of the blizzard pouring in unfettered. The wild winds whipped and hissed, sending snowflakes swirling around the room like vengeful specters. Despite the biting cold, Mark signaled for the group to split into teams of 2. One team stuck to the right, the other to the left. We hugged the walls, our eyes darting around the room, scouring the shadows for anything out of place. After a thorough sweep of the room, we regrouped at the entrance. It was clear the room was empty, but the heavy silence that followed was punctured when we noticed 3 large containers of supplies missing. Quickly checking the manifest, we discovered it was food. While not enough to affect our overall rations, the implications were grave. The myths and legends I had dismissed were now uncomfortably real, and the threat they posed was far too close for comfort. All of a sudden the term abominable snowman didn't seem so ridiculous. Before we could fully process the situation, another alarm sounded, this time from the front of the facility. It was a long, buzzing sound, the kind that sinks into your stomach and twists. Then the screams followed. They echoed through the halls, bouncing off the walls and filled us with powerful trepidation. We sprinted towards the noise, hearts pounding, minds racing. When we reached the front, we were met with a scene straight out of a nightmare. Shattered glass was strewn around the floor, the blizzard outside claiming the room through the broken window. The front door hung ajar, and a sinister trail of blood led towards the entrance. Frantically, I glanced around at the crew, mentally ticking off heads. It was Max Reynolds, the chef, who was missing. The realization was a gut punch. We were under attack. Mark, his face set in a grim line, ordered the facility into lockdown. The heavy doors slid into place with a resounding thud, the finality of the sound echoing in the now silent room. Outside, the blizzard raged on, oblivious to the terror unfolding within our walls. We were trapped, prey in our own base, with an unknown predator lurking in the shadows. The facility was in complete lockdown. Panic resonated through the corridors. I could sense the tension in every muscle of Tito, as we stood in the center of the chaos. As the remaining personnel reinforced every window, porthole, and door, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling in my chest. This was only the beginning, I thought. Something sinister was at play, and I was determined to steel myself. With a heavy heart, I made my way to my personal locker at the foot of my bed, retrieving my handgun. I checked the magazine to ensure it was loaded, the cold metal providing a small sense of security. With my hammer in hand, all I needed was some nails. Taking a deep breath, I began patrolling the halls, Tito never far from my side. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, a reminder of the solitude that enveloped me. Everyone was occupied with securing the facility, so I took it upon myself to do what I believed was the right thing to do. I found myself kneeling down before the bloody drag marks leading to the front entrance. The sight of the crimson stains, stood out harshly against the sterile white floors, made my stomach churn. Resolute to clean up the mess left behind, I reached for a cloth and a bucket of soapy water. On my hands and knees, I scrubbed away the remnants of the tragedy, the metallic scent of blood mingling with the sterile atmosphere. I'm not sure what God I believe in. Sadly, I said a prayer to myself for the man's soul. Tito watched me solemnly, his steady gaze filled with concern, and I was grateful for his loyalty. Especially now, he and his pistol were the only thing holding my sanity at bay. As I continued my task, the blizzard outside was unwavering and unrelenting, the howling wind battering the windows and walls of the research facility. It felt as though nature itself was conspiring against us, amplifying our isolation and vulnerability. I was sure I heard loud bangs again, but I forced them out of my mind. I fought my urge to throw up and continue the grim task at hand. The unsettling feeling of being watched crept into my consciousness. It was an instinct, a gut feeling that something or someone was observing our every move. I couldn't dismiss it as mere paranoia. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I pressed on, the scent of the detergent harsh against the back of my throat. I had never been much of a fan of eavesdropping. It always felt like a violation of some unspoken rule, an intrusion into private spaces not meant for me. But as I kneeled on the cold, hard floor, scrubbing away at the bloody mess, I couldn't help but overhear Maria and Alan. Their hushed whispers amplified off the sterile walls, reaching me in bits and pieces. Maria's voice was a soft whimper against the constant hum of the facility. I can't take it anymore, Alan," she said, the sheer terror in her voice puncturing the artificial soundscape of our surroundings. That fucking thing, it's going to tear us apart. I can't die like that, like some fucking animal." Alan's voice was a low murmur, a contrast to the fear in Maria's. "We'll get out of here, Maria. We'll take one of the four-wheelers and drive to the nearest substation. This place is compromised." "Maybe we can do better there," he said, a note of conspiracy seeping into his voice. Their words hung in the air as I continued scrubbing, the reality of the situation sinking in deeper with each passing syllable. I knew what they had planned would compromise the rest of the facility. Whatever chance we did have, it would be with all the equipment available. And every hand on deck. We were trapped, in this godforsaken place, with a creature out of some winter horror story stalking us. My blood ran cold at the thought. Meeting my anger somewhere in the middle. The loud, echoing gunshot broke through my thoughts, its sound reverberating through the metallic walls of the facility. I dropped the scrub brush, my heart pounding in my chest as I rushed towards the source of the noise. Tito was barking furiously beside me, his eyes wide and alert. Emily and Raj stood by a side-loading entrance, their bodies shaking as they fired blindly into the freezing wind outside. The harsh, metallic clang of bullets hitting the door pierced the air, adding to the cacophony of noise in the facility. But before they could load another clip, Mark rushed over, his face pale as he wrestled the guns from their trembling hands. they explained in hurried, frantic words. The creature had opened the door as they were securing it. Raj had acted quickly, firing before it could snatch anyone. The blood trail leading out of the ruined door sent a chill down my spine. Clearly it had been injured in the attempt. Mark Davis looked at the crowd. "You see that, it bleeds. If it bleeds, that means the motherfucker can die. I'm not saying we going some suicidal crusade, but some of us here were trained in combat scenarios and we humans are an inventive bunch. So I don't want to see any of you without a weapon. With what we have at the facility we should be able to hold down a room. At least until the blizzard passes. Our supply run will be here in the morning if it does, we just need to last till then." Tito, my faithful Cerberus, sat stoically by my side, his keen eyes scanning the quiet hallway. I volunteered for this position, the weight of my pistol a comforting presence in my holster. Among us, I was the only one with a working firearm in my personal gear. The remaining weapons in the facility had been distributed to those who knew how to use them, a short list that included Raj Patel, James, and Alex Turner. Inside the cafeteria, James, our communications expert, was sprawled across a table. His equipment, a tangle of wires and devices, was spread haphazardly across the surface. He was attempting to establish an external link, a task made impossible by the blizzard that raged outside. Alex Turner, the IT tech, looked out of place amidst the chaos. His petite frame and glasses gave him a nerdy air, but those who underestimated him did so at their peril. Despite his unassuming look, Alex was a force to be reckoned with. At least that's what everyone at the station said. The man was a martial arts enthusiast, a black belt in Kyokushin karate. His extensive knowledge of weaponry, garnered from hours spent immersed in video games, was yet to be tested. But his confident stance was testament to his preparedness. Tito wagged his tail as he met my gaze, the soft thump of it against the floor barely audible in the quiet. But as if sensing my inner turmoil, his demeanor changed when we both looked down the hall towards the main entrance. His ears perked up, his body tense and alert. I walked down the hall, Tito padding softly at my side. The tension in the air was almost physical, a frigid current that ran through the veins of the facility kept us all on edge. A loud bang echoed through the corridors, drawing me out of my thoughts. Anger bubbled up within me. I wasn't the only one. I saw others poke their heads out of their rooms, their faces twisted in a similar mix of frustration and concern. We moved as a flock towards the sound, our collective anxiety drawing us together like a magnet. The source of the commotion was soon revealed. Alan and Maria were at the back loading door, fervently prying off the last board that held it sealed. I could see the desperation in their eyes, and could almost taste their desire for freedom. Mark Davis pushed past me and the others, shouting something at the pair. His words fell on deaf ears. Alan and Maria were like wild animals, focused solely on their escape. With a final heave, the last board clattered to the ground. They were out in an instant, a blur of movement against the white backdrop of the blizzard. They disappeared on a four-wheeler, swallowed up by the swirling snow. There was a pause, a moment of silence as we all watched the empty space where our comrades stood. Then Mark barked out orders, breaking the spell. We needed to seal the door again, this breach of security was unacceptable. Before we begin the process, he turned to address the crowd once more. If anyone else has an escape plan, there's the door, don't waste any more of our supplies. I don't mean to sound harsh, but they knew the risks when they exited. And clearly they had no regard for our safety, so good luck to them. Now if everyone's firmly in the place they plan on being, let's get to work. I looked down at Tito, his dark eyes reflecting my own feelings. We had the same question, the same concern. Where was Lisa Anderson? She was the lead scientist, the one who might have answers. But she was nowhere to be found. My anger morphed into worry. I left the congregation behind, the echo of their tools and the groan of old wood filling the silent halls as they worked to reseal our sanctuary. Tito was at my side, his nose sniffing the air as we traversed the labyrinthine corridors. Each doorway we passed was a snapshot into solitary confinement, a glimpse into their makeshift homes in this frozen hell. The med bay was my destination. The scent of antiseptic hit me as soon as I pushed the door open. Lisa was there, sitting in a chair with her back to me. Her silhouette was still, almost peaceful. I took a step forward, my boots squeaking on the polished floor. But her voice stopped me. "Kevin, stop. I don't want you to get hurt." Her voice was soft, resigned. She didn't turn to look at me. Her words hung in the air, a question unanswered, a plea unfulfilled. And before I could react, before I could question or comfort, her head exploded. I recoiled, my hand flying to my mouth as I stifled a scream. The smell of gunpowder and blood filled the room. Bits of her skull and brain were scattered across the floor, clinging to the ceiling. I grabbed Tito, pulling him back from the horrifying sight. The last thing I wanted was for him to get a taste of the carnage. The gunshot had drawn the others. They poured into the hallway, their faces a fusion of confusion and horror. Mark Davis was at the forefront, his usually stern face softened with sorrow. He blocked the entrance to the med bay, his large frame obscuring the grisly scene from the onlookers. His voice was steady as he asked everyone to respect the dead and stay back. Karen Walker, our only medical technician, had been with the group barricading the door. She rushed past Mark, her professional demeanor momentarily faltered at the sight of Lisa. She quickly recovered, setting to work covering up the body with a sheet. It was a gruesome task, one that I was grateful to not have to perform. The whispers started as soon as the door closed. Theories, accusations, prayers. The fear was back, a palpable entity that seeped into every crack and crevice. The sight of Lisa, her lifeblood splattered across the tiles and the copper smell of the scene, had left a sickening pit in my stomach. All thoughts of duty and responsibility seemed ludicrous now. The only thing I wanted was to retreat to my room, to bury myself under the blankets and pretend that this nightmare was just that, a dream. I stood by the window, the blizzard outside blurring the line between ground and sky. It was a swirling white canvas, devoid of definition or clarity. The thought of the creature out there, hidden in the vast expanse of the storm, sent a wave of nausea through my body. As if on cue, Tito growled, his hackles raised. His body was tense, a canine mohawk of fear ran down his length. "What is it, boy?" I asked, my voice a mere whisper in the room. But Tito was already bolting out the door, his lithe body a blur of movement. I followed him as best as I could, my own pace hindered by my human limitations. By the time I caught up to him, we were at the loading bay once again. Tito was sniffing around, his nose leading him to a closet. I called out to him and he trotted back to my side. Together, we approached the closet. I drew my handgun, I reached for the doorknob, twisting it open. I was back in position, both hands on my gun, ready to fire at whatever might be hiding inside. But the closet was empty. I would have dismissed it as nothing if I hadn't looked down. The floor of the closet had been ripped out, the metal grating shredded and the wood splintered. There was a hole, big enough for a large man or perhaps the beast to fit through. I stared at the hole, my mind racing. The creature was here, inside the facility. It had managed to infiltrate our sanctuary. I turned to Tito, his own gaze fixed on the hole. He whined softly, a small sound that echoed my own dread. Tito and I raced down the hall, his leash taut in my hand. The pounding of my boots mirrored the rhythm of my heart. I rapped on the med bay door. Mark Davis's voice, muffled by the barrier, spoke harshly. "Piss off, there's nothing to see here. I know you people are bored, but there's got to be something better to do than stand around and gawk at the dead." "It's me, Kevin," I replied in the calmest manner I could give in the state of my panic. I felt like every second I wasted was another that the creature got to strike again. I knocked even harder. "We have a bigger problem out here," I shouted through the door. That got his attention. The door creaked open and Mark's head appeared. He looked harried, his eyes bloodshot from the stress of the day. I suggested a more private conversation and he stepped out, sealing the med bay behind him. I led him to my quarters. Tito stood guard outside, his ears perked and alert. Inside, I relayed the discovery I had made. Mark's eyes widened as I described the hole, the shredded metal and the splintered wood. He asked if I was sure and I replied with a dry chuckle, "It's kind of hard to miss a hole in the floor." Mark apologized, blaming his lapse on the sudden drama. We were down 4 people now. The burden of leadership was taking its toll on him. I could see it in the slump of his shoulders, the lines on his face. I stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing the best you can, Mark," I said, looking him in the eyes. "This place would be in utter chaos if you weren't in charge. Together, we can come up with a plan. There has to be a way to flush the creature out." Mark nodded, a grim determination in his eyes. "But where would a creature that's damn near 9 foot tall even hide?" he asked, voicing the question that neither of us wanted to answer. We needed to know, despite the fear that gnawed at our guts. I looked at Tito, his tail wagging at the sound of my voice. "Tito got a good sense of him," I said. "It's possible he might be able to sniff him out. If anything, it was a place to start." Tito led the way, his nose close to the ground, sniffing out the scent of the beast. Mark and I followed. The trail led us back to the closet, to the shredded wood and scattered metal. Tito's tail wagged with determination as we followed the trail to a descending staircase. We collectively took a deep breath and descended into the bowels of the station, down a staircase that led to cold storage and experimentation node 3. The space was filled with preserved samples from our Antarctic mission, rows and rows of containers filled with frozen fragments of the icy landscape. As we ventured deeper, we came across a grim scene. Blood spattered the floor, leading to a wooden desk that bore the marks of the creature's claws. And behind the workstation, in the small bathroom, was Emily Baker. Her body was torn apart, her lifeblood painting the bathroom in a grisly tableau. My stomach churned at the sight of her, but there was no time for grief. A thunderous crash echoed through the room, and the beast burst through the wall. It lashed out, catching Mark off guard. Its claws ripped through his flesh, severing his jaw. His mandible fell to the ground, his hands clutching at the gaping wound in his face. I raised my gun, firing 2 shots into the creature's shoulder. It roared in pain, a bellowing sound that shook the room. With a final crash, it disappeared through the opposite wall, leaving a shower of drywall and wood in its wake. I rushed to Mark's side, but it was too late. His eyes were glazed over, his body limp. The life had left him, claimed by the beast. I looked up just in time to see a blur of movement. Tito was chasing after the creature, disappearing through the hole in the wall. I picked up my gun, my heart pounding in my chest, and gave chase. We were further underground now, in the tunnels where we conducted seismic experiments. The blood trail was my guide, a macabre breadcrumb trail that led deeper into the earth. The trail ended at a gap in the natural wall, a gaping maw of darkness that swallowed up any light. I squinted into the darkness, my gun held firm in my trembling hands. The beast was here, somewhere in the shadows. And so was Tito. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. And then I stepped into the unknown. The darkness swallowed me whole, wrapping its inky tendrils around me as I pushed forward into the expanse. The chill of the Antarctic seeped up from the ground, a harsh reminder of the unforgiving landscape that surrounded us. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed in the silence of my head. The cold of the air bit my flesh and the silence was almost deafening. My hand tightened around the grip of my gun, the cold metal familiarity in the alien environment. I strained my ears, trying to pick out any sound that could indicate Tito's whereabouts or the presence of the beast. But the tunnel was silent, an oppressive quiet that seemed to muffle even my own breathing. I continued on, one cautious foot in front of the other, my eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. The beam of my flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing the rough-hewn walls of the tunnel and the blood trail that smeared the ground. The beast had been injured, that much was clear. But whether it was enough to slow it down, I didn't know. As I traversed deeper into the bowels of the earth, a sense of unease settled over me. We were in the beast's domain now. This was its world, a place of darkness and cold. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. But it wasn't the cold that made me shiver. It was the anticipation, the fear of what lurked in the shadows. I thought I can faintly hear a growl coming from ahead. Suddenly, the sound amplified through the tunnel, a rumbling sound that drained the blood from my face. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. That was Tito. I could recognize that growl anywhere. It was the sound he made when he was cornered, when he was ready to fight. "Here we go," I murmured to myself. I tightened my grip on the gun, my knuckles white. I was ready, or at least as ready as I could be. With a deep breath, I pushed forward, following the sound of Tito's growl, ready to face the creature. The tunnel opened up into a large cavern, the ceiling lost in the blackness above. My flashlight landed on Tito, his body tense, his eyes fixed on a hulking shape in the shadows. The beast. I raised my gun, my finger on the trigger. But before I could fire, the beast lunged. The fight had begun. And I was in the middle of it, in the heart of darkness, with nothing but my gun and my courage to keep me alive. My first shot went wide and smacked against the icy wall. To my count I only had 6 shots left, my next ones would have to count. I ducked a wide arcing swing, the end of which tore a chunk of debris from the wall that weighed as much as 3 men. From my lowered position I shot upwards into the creature's chest, the shot went through under the nipple and never came back out. This sent a shock wave of terror through me when the beast let out its bellowing roar of pain. The sound shook loose icicles from the ceiling. Tito took this as an opportunity and launched himself at the beast. The large dog's jaws snapped shut on the monster's forearm, bringing forth another loud cry from the beast. It tried to shake Tito loose, but the dog wouldn't relent an inch. In a desperate attempt to free itself from the canine's grip, it put its way behind a thrust into the wall. This proved to be effective in dislodging Tito's teeth, and the dog fell limply to the ground. "Tito!" I screamed loud enough to put the beast bellows to shame. I lifted my gun trained right on its head and emptied every last shot into it. The first one proved to be fatal, the rest were me checking its pulse. When the gun of my hand clicked, the weight of it was still heavy in my hand. I climbed on top of the abomination's barrel chest, and brought it down blow after blow. The impact of the gun's butt shattered bone on the first hit. Everything went red, the sound that filled my ears was like static. All I can remember after that was beating a pulverized pile of meat until my hands were sore and my gun was a broken piece of metal in my hands. After that everything was a blur, the white of the cave melding with the white of the med bay as my consciousness fluttered. I woke up to a throbbing pain in my head, and the first thing I did, even before checking my own wounds, was to scan the room for Tito. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by shock when I saw him on a slab, incubated and sedated. The sound of the monitor's beeping was a grim comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. The room was bright, and the only other person present was Raj Patel. He urged me to take it easy as I attempted to sit up from the table. Turning my head to the left, I saw the lifeless body of Sarah Anderson, her skull covered in a blood-soaked blanket. Raj asked if I was okay, and my response was laced with anger. "Of course, I'm not okay." As I tried to stand, my legs went rubbery, and Raj leaped from his seat, catching me before I hit the ground. He insisted I sit down and take it easy. I gestured toward Tito, my voice filled with frustration. "Do you see what that bastard did to Tito?" Raj's response was cold. "By the looks of it, you got your revenge on the creature." I pointed to the gurney next to me, where the lead scientist lay lifeless. "This is going to be us if we don't get out of here," I told Raj, my voice trembling. Raj's words were grim but practical. "Until the storm passes, there's nothing we can do. No one is coming to help, and the nearest research base is hundreds of miles to the northwest. We'd freeze in the elements before we made it there." I fought against the dizziness that threatened to consume me. Raj stood by the med bay window, his grip firm on his rifle. The silence of the room was broken only by the sound of his voice, devoid of emotion. "By the way, I know why Sarah killed herself," Raj spoke, his gaze fixed on the blizzard as if searching for answers amidst the swirling snow. I sat up, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. His words lingered for a moment, and I felt a sinking feeling in my gut. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling, my mind scattered from the concussion. Raj reached into his back pocket and retrieved a crumpled piece of paper. He handed it to me, and I took it hesitantly, unfolding it with trembling hands. The suicide letter held only one phrase, "I'm sorry." I looked up at Raj, my eyes wide with disbelief. How could a single sentence explain a tragedy such as the one lying next to me? Her cold hand hung from the blanket as I spoke. "I don't understand," I muttered, my voice a raspy whisper. Raj left his post by the window and walked over to a nearby desk, where a laptop sat waiting. He typed something into the prompt, his fingers moving with purpose. Then, he turned the screen toward me, and my heart skipped a beat. The information displayed on the laptop screen revealed that our mission here was not solely focused on geological research, as we had been led to believe. It was much more than that. The facility we were in had been conducting research on Yeti. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling with a mix of shock and disbelief. So many questions flooded my thoughts. The presence of numerous biologists suddenly made sense. As the realization sank in, a mixture of anger and frustration welled up within me. We had been deceived, used as pawns in a game far more dangerous than we were led to believe. I took a breath, my ribs aching, and looked over at my dog. Tito lay motionless except for the rise and fall of his sides, eyes closed. Bandages swathed his leg and torso. Will he be okay?" Raj nodded calmly. "His injuries were severe, but I treated them as best I could. He just needs rest. You both gave me quite a scare, finding you down there unconscious and bleeding. I thought the fucking thing had gotten y'all too. Mr. Young is doing some repairs and we're tossing some food together. It's been hours since I can think. I'm just so damn hungry, and scared. I can't lie to you, man, I'm fucking scared." I sank back, shutting my eyes for a moment. How long had I been out? I opened my mouth to ask a question, but before I could speak, a low rumble vibrated the metal wall next to me. My eyes flew open as the sound repeated, closer this time, like thunder? I croaked. But this booming was all wrong for a storm. Raj frowned, deep in thought, as outside whatever was approaching let loose another earthquaking roar. My head still swam with lingering fatigue and pain, but Tito's sudden growl cut through the fog like a bolt of adrenaline. I blinked myself more alert and followed my dog's rigid focus to the trembling wall beside us. The booming was louder now, with an unmistakable guttural edge that raised the hairs on my neck. Tito stood stiffly on three legs, favoring his injured one but alert as if sensing some evil approaching. "Do you smell it, boy?" I asked softly. Tito gave a low warning bark without tearing his eyes from the wall. That's when I caught the acrid stench myself, something feral and primitive that set off ancient alarm bells in my DNA. I glanced at Raj, my question dying on my lips at the grim set of his jaw. He had his rifle up, peering through a meager gap in the metal sheeting. I struggled to sit up for a better view, and what I saw sent a chill down my battered spine. Two massive, shaggy silhouettes loomed indistinctly just past the howling snow dunes. They paced back and forth as if gathering their horde. Raj muttered a curse under his breath. Before I could ask what he saw, he flicked the rifle's safety off with an audible click and took aim. The reports split the air like cannon cracks, deafening in the small medical room. Tito snarled and the shadows beyond let out dual enraged bellows that told us the shot had found a target. My ribs protested as I dragged myself upright. Whatever Raj had drawn first blood against, it was now thoroughly enraged. And we were trapped in its hunting grounds with no other defense than the few rounds left in Raj's gun. It was time to make our last stand, whatever god Raj prayed to had his patronage in that moment. I could see his lips working some prayer. My only ask was that his god extended some divine intervention to me, if he decided to deliver. I found myself making the mark of the cross at a loss of what else I could do to aid the moment. I knew I got lucky in that last encounter, only really getting the upper hand because of my blind rage and reckless abandon. This time, I'm sure whatever is out there, plans on evening the odds tonight. I stood patient in the briefing room of the research facility, surrounded by the last remaining people alive, Raj Patel, Mr. Young, Alex Turner, and Tito, my loyal dog. The weight of the situation pressed down on us, and I knew that I was the only one capable of forming a rational thought at this moment. I turned to Mr. Young, who had been oddly quiet since the beginning of this nightmare. "We need to cut the power," I said, my voice steady, but urgency lacing every word. Young began to protest, but I interrupted him with a firm, "Trust me." I then turned to Alex Turner and asked, "Is your thermal tech still running and accessible?" Alex nodded and quickly brought up the thermal imaging on his device. He instantly saw where I was going with this, his eyes widening as the plan formed in his mind. Raj finally broke the silence. "Your plan to lure them in," he stated more than asked, his voice edged with incredulity. I nodded. "That's just the first part of it," I explained. "We need to get them inside where we can kill them without taking too much risk. It's the only way we survive." Raj checked the clip of his gun and saw that he had almost a full magazine. The other 2 guns, one for me and one for Alex, were loaded and ready. We didn't have much ammunition left, so every shot had to count. Tito, sensing the tension in the room, remained at my side. He would play a crucial role in our plan, his highly tuned senses would act as an alert system. "This time we'll know when they're coming, we will be prepared." As I looked around at the faces of my companions, I could see the fear of all who tried to mask it. I stood frozen as I watched Tito. His injured paw lifted, he pointed every sense in the direction of the open door. As if on cue, and just as we had planned, all power in the facility came to a dead stop. The silence that followed was deafening. Beside me, Raj Patel and Alex Turner were glued to the thermal imaging screen, their eyes scanning for any sign of heat that would break the solid blue the blizzard provided on the feed. Tito let out a low growl, and we all raised our firearms in response. Both Alex and Raj held their rifles as steady as they could, but I could see their hands shaking. I found myself alternating between looking at the thermal readout and lining up my target through the iron sights of my own rifle. Then, a loud roar bellowed from outside, causing Tito to tense. Alex was the first to spot it. "Right there, 90 degrees, he called out, and we all looked to see the heat signature of something large passing the doorway. Without a moment's hesitation, we opened fire, sending a wild hail of bullets into the blizzard. Raj, either out of a spike of adrenaline or pure stupidity, persisted in his firing long after the rest of us had stopped. He stepped closer and closer to the door, his face twisted in a fit of furious anger. I tried to warn him about the approaching heat signature, but it was too late. In an instant, something snatched him into the blizzard, leaving nothing but a trail of heat on our screen. His screams died in the air before falling away in the distance, swallowed up by the storm. We were left in the silence of the facility, the echo of our gunfire fading as we stared into the blue void of the thermal imaging screen, the reality of our situation sinking in. Tito's head cocked to the right, I followed suit with my barrel. Tito barked, and so did my gun. The well-cloaked creature screamed in agony and launched itself from the shaded space. My gun barked again, the recoil pressing its butt firmly into my shoulder. I let off another, followed by another. In the 20 feet it took the creature to get to me, every step it took was slower. When the creature was within grabbing distance of me, the wounds had made their mark. The creature collapsed, and when it hit the ground it coughed a spray of blood into the air. Alex Turner came running from behind me wielding a fireman's axe. He let the blade arc down and slammed into the skull of the creature. He tried to retract it, but it was to no avail. Without warning, Tito turned his head again and on 3 legs galloped towards the entrance. I was hot on the dog's heels, and when I got within 3 feet of him I saw the looming figure within the threshold of the door. It took deep breaths, a mist of hot oxygen blowing from its nostrils. Every breath I watched its large shoulders rise and fall. The look it was giving me was pure hatred. It lowered its large head to Tito. I shouted for its attention. When I looked back up at me, its face was illuminated by the spark of my barrel. The shot struck the creature in the right cheek, but the wound was not fatal. It only served to enrage the beast. It lunged forward. I barely dodged its grasp cause its weight fell where I had just stood seconds ago. The linoleum tiles beneath cracked under its bulk. I retreated further into the entryway, putting some distance between us. But no quicker than I put a gap in the space, the creature closed it. Its massive white furry frame bulged through the doorway, cracking and splintering the walls and molding that held it in place. Once its monstrous frame was on the other side, it picked up momentum and chased after me like a runaway train. In its pursuit, I heard it slam its large fist against the wall and shatter concrete on impact, the sound of screeching metal bent under its grasp. It was closing in on me. I could smell its dank breath. As I came to a fork in my path where the hallways diverged into directions, I felt the sinking feeling fall upon me. I was trapped. I raised my gun, closed my eyes, and let Jesus pull the trigger. This shot hammered into the creature's eye socket, stunting its momentum midway. Like someone snipped the strings holding it up, the creature collapsed lifeless to the floor mid-run. The impact was devastating and its face slid across the floor to a stop. I took a step forward, looming over the beast. It's a powerful bear trap like a hand snap shut on my ankle. As it pulled me under its broken frame like an unwilling lover, I slammed my fist into its face, trying my best to hit the bullet wounds. With one hand the creature pinned my hands above my head. The smell of its breath was revolting. I closed my eyes and resigned myself to my fate, but before death could guide me elsewhere, Tito launched from the doorway to latch onto the beast's throat. Its powerful jaws clamped down, and the creature released its grip on me, desperate to free itself from the dog's relentless attack. In that brief moment, I saw an opportunity, a chance to save Tito and put an end to this monstrous threat once and for all. With adrenaline surging through my veins, I swiftly moved toward the chaotic scene. The cacophony of growls, snarls, and the creature's desperate attempts to break free filled the air. I knew I had to act quickly, for Tito's life hung in the balance. I reached for my gun, my fingers trembling with a strong dose of fear in my veins. I felt the weight of the weapon in my hand as I approached the flailing creature. Its massive form writhed and thrashed, but the dog held on with unrelenting tenacity. As I got closer, my heart pounded in my chest, drowning out the sounds of the battle in front of me. Time seemed to slow, and everything became a blur, except for the back of the creature's head. Summoning every ounce of courage, I pressed the gun firmly against the creature's skull. My finger found the trigger, and with a surge of resolve, I pulled the trigger. A deafening blast erupted from the gun, momentarily overpowering the chaos around us. The bullet tore through the air, flesh and bone. The creature's body jerked violently as the shot pierced its skull, and a fountain of blood erupted from the wound. In that instant, the battle reached its climactic crescendo. The white ape beast, now lifeless, crashed to the ground in a thunderous thud. I leaped forward, my muscles straining with effort, and lifted the dead bulk of the creature off of Tito. As I pulled the lifeless body away, Tito, still panting heavily, limped from under it, his fur stained with the blood of our fallen enemy. He nuzzled against me. I glanced down at the lifeless creature, its menacing presence finally vanquished. For the past 29 hours, Tito and I had huddled together in fear, praying that no more creatures would come out the woodwork. We were the only survivors left in the desolate research station, and our chances of making it out alive seemed slim. The entranceway, once a sturdy barrier, now lay in ruins, leaving us vulnerable and exposed. With no way to barricade the broken entrance, we had retreated to the safety of my personal quarters. It was a small room, but it offered some solace from the harsh reality outside. Food wasn't an issue, we were fortunate enough to have a well-stocked base. However, without power to restore the heating elements, the bitter cold seeped into our space. Desperation drove us to burn paperwork and cardboard, anything to generate a meager amount of warmth. The flickering flames danced in the darkness, the crackling of the makeshift fire was the only sound that pierced the silence of the station. Hour after hour, we clung to each other for warmth and comfort. Tito, still recovering from his injuries, limped three-leggedly by my side. His loyalty and resilience were a source of inspiration in those bleak moments. Together, we braved the cold, our breath forming frosty clouds in the air. Then, on the 29th hour since we had taken down the creature in the entranceway, a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon, a supply helicopter. Its deafening roar shattered the stillness of the base, and suddenly I felt electrically charged. I rushed outside, waving my hands frantically, desperately trying to catch the pilot's attention. Tito followed closely behind, his injured leg slowing him down. The pilot quickly assessed our situation. He didn't need an explanation to see that we were in desperate need of medical attention. With a swift nod, the pilot signaled for us to board the aircraft. I helped Tito up the steps, his warm breath mingling with mine in the frigid air. As the helicopter lifted off, the research station grew smaller and smaller beneath us. 2 hours separated us from the nearest hospital. As the helicopter soared through the icy landscape, I couldn't help but reflect on the events that had unfolded. The snow-covered mountains, once a source of fascination and adventure, now held a haunting memory. I hoped that one day, with time and healing, I would be able to put this nightmare behind me. But for now, all I could do was hold Tito close, his presence a reminder of our will to live. I vowed to myself that I would never take the simple comforts of life for granted again. And as the helicopter carried us away from the frozen wasteland, I hoped I'd never see snow again.